The sun beats down on the Nafud Desert, an endless ocean of red sand where no map can be trusted. The year is 1914. The Ottoman Empire is slowly crumbling, and the winds of a global war are gathering just beyond the horizon. Out in this unforgiving wilderness, where temperatures boil the blood and the terrain shifts with every violent sandstorm, a small caravan moves slowly through the distorted heat haze. At its head rides a figure who defies everything the world expects. She is not a soldier. She is not a conqueror with a massive armed escort. She is a solitary Englishwoman, hundreds of miles from the safety of her aristocratic life, charting a world entirely unknown to the powerful empires of the West. She speaks the dialects of the tribes perfectly. She knows their ancient bloodlines, their bitter feuds, and their alliances. She reads the shifting sands like an open book. She is venturing into the dark heart of Arabia, into a hostile, isolated stronghold where few outsiders have ever survived. Before we journey deeper into the uncharted sands, if stories of lost worlds and impossible human journeys fascinate you, consider subscribing to Wonders and Frontiers. The generals and politicians back in London would eventually call her a spy, a brilliant diplomat, a pioneering archaeologist, and an architect of nations. But to the nomadic tribes who watched her cross the silent dunes, she was something else entirely. She was the queen of the desert. Her name was Gertrude Bell, and she was about to draw the lines that would change the modern world forever. The journey to the extreme edge of the map did not begin in the blazing heat of the desert, but in the suffocating, velvet-lined halls of Victorian England. Born into immense wealth and privilege, she was expected to follow a predictable script. She was supposed to marry well, to host elegant dinners, and to live a quiet life defined by the stone walls of a grand estate. But she was deeply restless. The polite, hushed conversations of high society felt like a cage to a mind that hungered for the unknown. She devoured books. She learned Persian. She learned Arabic. She sought out ancient stones and forgotten languages that had echoed through millennia. Eventually, she could no longer endure the damp fog and rigid rules of London. She traded the corsets and ballrooms for the saddle and the blinding light of the East. When she finally stepped into the vast expanse of the Syrian desert, it was not merely an adventure. It was the shedding of an old skin. The profound silence of the open plains called to her. She rode for days across the cracking earth, the wind carrying the metallic scent of dust and the promise of distant rain. She slept under a canopy of brilliant freezing stars, completely surrounded by the fallen pillars and shattered stones of empires that had risen and collapsed long before the modern age. She dug her bare hands into the soil of forgotten cities, tracing the buried foundations of palaces swallowed by time. This was her true threshold. She was no longer a wealthy tourist observing from afar. She was becoming a permanent part of the landscape. She mapped the hidden water wells. She recorded the oral poetry of the Bedouin. She sat around smoky campfires under the night sky, drinking bitter cardamom coffee, listening intensely to the murmurs of tribal wars and shifting loyalties. She understood quickly that the desert was not an empty void waiting to be claimed by European powers. It was a complex, living web of honor, blood, and survival. The deeper she rode into the unknown, the more dangerous the terrain became. By 1913, driven by a dangerous obsession to map the completely uncharted regions of Central Arabia, she set her sights on the city of Hayil. It was a legendary fortress town deep in the harsh interior, ruled by the fierce and fiercely paranoid Al-Rashid dynasty. Her local guides begged her to turn back. The desert was completely lawless, caught in the grip of a brutal tribal war. The risk of death was absolute, but she refused to stop. She pushed her caravan across agonizing stretches of sun-scorched black rock. They strictly rationed their water. They endured blistering, suffocating heat by day and bone-chilling, unforgiving cold by night. Every step forward was a step further from rescue. When she finally reached the towering mud-brick walls of Hayil, there was no welcoming committee. The heavy wooden gates closed firmly behind her. She was immediately escorted deep into the fortress and placed under strict house arrest. Days bled into weeks. The heavy silence of her luxurious but locked quarters was terrifying. She did not know if she would be used as a political pawn, held for an impossible ransom, or simply executed quietly in the shadows. The men who ruled the city were ruthless, and the British government was far too distant to save her. She had nothing to rely on but her own sharp mind. Through sheer force of personality, perfectly calibrated calm diplomacy, and an unbreakable nerve, she slowly negotiated with her captors. She engaged them in complex political discussions, proving her deep respect for their culture. Miraculously, she negotiated her way out. She left the fortress of Hayil not just with her life but with invaluable intelligence, leather-bound diaries full of precise observations, and a map of a hostile region no Western power had ever understood. Her timing was profound, and the consequences would shake the globe. Merely months later, the world was plunged into the devastating chaos of the Great War. The Middle East rapidly became a sprawling, bloody battlefield. Suddenly, the mighty British Empire desperately needed the exact knowledge that only she possessed. They urgently called her to Cairo. She was placed in a smoke-filled room full of hardened generals and seasoned diplomats, the only woman among high-ranking military men. They had heavy guns. They had massive armies. But she had the map. She knew exactly which tribal leader hated which, where the vital water wells were hidden, and who could actually be trusted in the shifting sands. She worked closely alongside T.E. Lawrence, the young officer history would later romanticize as Lawrence of Arabia. But while Lawrence blew up railway lines and led daring guerrilla charges across the dunes, it was Gertrude Bell who provided the precise intelligence, the strategic framework, and the profound understanding of the human terrain. The desert was bleeding. Ancient empires were violently collapsing. And in the thick smoke and dust of the falling Ottoman Empire, the entire map of the Middle East was completely erased, waiting to be redrawn. When the heavy artillery finally fell silent, the real, most dangerous battle began. The victorious European powers gathered to carve up the shattered ruins of the East. Politicians, sitting in quiet, comfortable rooms, drew straight, arbitrary lines across ancient sands, completely blind to the complex realities of the tribes that lived and died there. But Gertrude Bell was physically there on the ground, fighting desperately to give a cohesive shape to a new nation. She rode relentlessly through the dusty plains of Mesopotamia, holding endless consultations with powerful sheikhs, navigating ancient blood feuds, and trying to forge a unified country out of three completely fractured, wildly different Ottoman provinces. Through her immense influence and unmatched geographical knowledge, she was instrumental in creating the borders of what would soon become Iraq. She stood proudly in the blazing sun of Baghdad in 1921, watching as King Faisal was officially crowned. It was the absolute climax of her life's extraordinary work. She had helped birth a nation from the ashes of war. She walked through the crowded, dusty streets of Baghdad not as a foreign observer, but as a recognized kingmaker, a living legend in her own time. She had achieved what no woman and very few men had ever accomplished. But the lines forcefully drawn in the sand carry a very heavy, lingering price. The rigid borders she helped create forced rival ethnic and religious groups together, unintentionally sowing the deep seeds for decades of tragic future conflict. And as the new formal government took firm hold, the career politicians and quiet bureaucrats arrived from London. The bold pioneer was no longer needed. The fierce desert explorer was swiftly replaced by office clerks in neat suits. She found herself increasingly sidelined, her once massive influence fading rapidly in the very country she had personally helped create. The world had moved on, and she was left behind. Her final years were not spent riding freely across the open wind-swept dunes. She stayed in Baghdad, throwing her remaining fading energy into one last obsession. She founded the Baghdad Archaeological Museum, desperately fighting to keep the priceless ancient treasures of Mesopotamia in the actual land where they were discovered. She walked slowly among the towering stone statues of winged bulls and examined shattered clay tablets bearing the world's oldest writing. She was surrounded by the silent ghosts of Babylon and Sumer. She was fiercely protecting the deep past, perhaps because she felt she had completely lost her grip on the future. The intense, punishing desert heat and the weight of her massive life eventually took their toll. She grew physically frail, deeply exhausted by the relentless sun, the bitter political betrayals, and a deep, crushing loneliness that she could never quite map or conquer. In the stifling heat of the summer of 1926, she simply went to sleep in her quiet Baghdad home and never woke up. The exact cause of her passing remains a lingering mystery. Perhaps it was a lethal dose of sleeping pills, perhaps a tragic accident, or perhaps a quiet, intentional surrender by a brilliant woman who knew her great journey had finally come to an end. Today, the winds still howl fiercely across the vast red sands of the Nefud Desert, erasing human footprints and swallowing forgotten ruins. The rigid borders drawn in those distant quiet rooms have cracked, shifted, and bled for a century. The mighty empires she served are completely gone, reduced to pages in history books. But beneath the shifting sands and within the complex soul of the Middle East, her complicated legacy heavily remains. She was a woman who rejected a life of absolute safety and comfort for a life of magnificent, terrifying danger. She stared directly into the vast, unforgiving unknown and sought not just to conquer it, but to truly understand it. Her remarkable story is a powerful reminder of the incredible world-shifting power and the devastating, quiet tragedy of human ambition. She deeply loved the desert, and in the end the desert claimed her, making her a permanent, inseparable part of its ancient history.